Chapter 4. 1 month later. "Lily, you better get down here if you want breakfast while it's warm." Her mother's voice carried up the stairs, and it held the note of annoyance Lily was used to hearing from her mother when she was working on her last nerve. With a sigh, Lily turned off the curling iron and set it on the counter. Her hair wasn't being agreeable this morning, but it wasn't awful either. She tossed her head down and then up, tousled the blonde locks with her fingers, and decided it would have to do. Flicking off the bathroom light, she grabbed a jacket and headed downstairs. March was fickle in Washington State. Some days it was warm, others cool, but one thing she could count on was that it would start off cool enough to need a jacket. The aroma of pancakes, syrup, and bacon met Lily's nose before she entered the kitchen, and she sighed. None of that was on her current eating plan. It wasn't that she was overweight, but she definitely was curvier than most of her peers. When she got older, she figured she would enjoy that. But right now, she was 16 and in high school. Anything over the perfectly accepted limit of tiny was too much. So she decided to skip the pancakes and grab a piece of fruit from the fridge and a cup of coffee instead. "You should not be drinking coffee so young," her mother said with a shake of her head. "I didn't start drinking coffee until I was well into my 20s. "I know, Mom. You tell me that every day." Lily turned away from her and rolled her eyes as she grabbed the creamer and added a dose. Rolling her eyes at her mother was a surefire way to get grounded, and she could not be grounded anytime soon. The spring fling dance at her high school was approaching, and she had been looking forward to it for weeks. Her dress was picked, her hair appointment was set, and her date was a gorgeous boy by the name of Bryce Hawkins. "Can't you at least have some toast or an egg with that fruit?" Her mother's face wrinkled in concern, sending tiny lines stretching out from the corner of her mouth and eyes. "I can't see how one piece of fruit will fill you up until lunch. You need some protein." What her mother didn't know was that one piece of fruit didn't fill Lily up until lunch. But her best friend Katie always had snacks, and because she loved Lily so much, she always shared. That generally held her over until lunch, and on days when it didn't, she would break down and purchase a muffin from the kitchen during morning break time. Yes, the calories were unfathomable, but she always made sure to run an extra mile, as well as attend the gym on those days to balance it out. "I'll be fine, Mom." She set her mug and orange down on the counter and opened the pantry. "Look, I'll even take a protein bar if it'll make you feel better." Lily held the bar up for her mother's inspection and sighed with relief when her mother threw her hands up and shook her head. She had won the battle. For now. Before she had a chance to enjoy her meager breakfast, the alarm on her phone began chiming, reminding her it was time to get going. After shoving the bar in her pocket, she'd have to remember to put it in her backpack in the car, or she'd have a melted mess when she got around to eating it. She took one last swig of her coffee and gave her mother a quick peck on the cheek. "Be back at 5, she hollered as she made her way out the front door. Lily slid into the seat of her slightly used Ford Taurus. It was not the car she had wanted for her birthday, but it was better than nothing. She fished the protein bar out of her pocket and tossed it and her bag on the passenger seat. Then she turned up the music and backed out of the driveway. She didn't live far from the school, but the drive, jamming out to her favorite music, was the perfect way to start the day. If she had to attend school, she might as well do it right. Her best friend Katie was waiting for her as she pulled into the parking lot. She generally made it to school before Lily did. In fact, there had been times when Lily wondered if she slept at the building some nights. Katie loved school, and not the walking the halls and seeing friends side of school. No. She was the nose in the book studying and learning type of student. so she generally met Lily before she made it to her locker each morning. However, waiting at her parking spot was new. "Did you hear?" she asked, handing Lily a cup of coffee as she climbed out of the car. Katie was a Starbucks snob, and she ordered one nearly every morning. But Lily didn't mind, since coffee was partly how she got her fuel anyway. She took a sip of the proffered cup, enjoying the warmth that spread down her throat. Though no longer winter, the cold seemed to hang around a lot longer in the state of Washington, and it was still chilly this morning. "Hear what?" Lily didn't watch the news, and Katie knew that. If it didn't involve Lily directly, it didn't usually end up on her radar. "There's an outbreak in China of some virus." "Seriously?" Lily's ears perked up. Though current events were not her forte, a pandemic was her one morbid curiosity. Ever since the day she'd read The Stand by Stephen King, she'd been fascinated by pandemics. It wasn't that she wanted one to happen, it was more like she wondered how one could happen, how it would affect the world, and what it would be like to live through one. "Yeah, seriously." She flipped her long brown hair over one shoulder as she fell into step beside Lily. "I can't believe you don't watch the news. I bet Mr. Higgins makes us study it." Mr. Higgins was their science teacher, but he must have taught at a college once because he was the hardest teacher in the school. His papers were the bane of Lily's and every other non-studious student's existence. Ugh, I hope he doesn't make us do a paper on it. Papers were the quickest way to steal her interest in any subject. "He probably will. Plus, I bet he makes us research the disease and track the possibility of it reaching over here. Maybe he'll even let us dig more into viruses and how they work." Her eyes lit up as she rambled off the options. She was such a nerd that Lily sometimes wondered how they stayed friends. But it was probably because they'd known each other since birth. Their mothers had met at some prenatal yoga class and become fast friends. As they lived near each other, their friendship had continued, even after the girls were born, with playdates and get-togethers. Katie and Lily had been destined to be friends no matter what they did. Thankfully, they seemed to balance each other well. Katie was more studious and helped keep Lily academically focused, but she also had a tendency to believe crazy theories, and Lily kept her more grounded in reality. "Yeah, well, let's not give him any ideas. I don't mind talking about it, but I don't want to research it for the next month. The spring fling is coming up, and I have much more important ways to spend my time. Like slow dancing in Bryce's arms," she thought to herself, picturing the moment in her mind. Bryce was a senior, and one Lily had set her sights on since freshman year. She hadn't thought he would ever notice her, but somehow, miraculously, this year he had. She didn't know if it was the fact that she finally had a class with him, or the fact that she ditched her oversized tunics and leggings for skinny jeans and tighter shirts. Whatever the reason, she'd caught his eye, and 2 weeks ago, he'd asked her to the spring fling. The spring fling was as close to a prom as their small school got. They didn't have the money or the student numbers to hold a large prom, but the school would generally rent out a nice banquet hall and cater dinner. Students would dress up in formal attire and dance the night away. Lily looked forward to it every year, but this year was guaranteed to top them all. Science was her first class of the day, and the room was already abuzz with conversation. Hannah and Gretchen both had their phones out and were taking turns flashing their screens at each other as they found some story they wanted to share. Christian and Adam sat side by side peering into a laptop screen. Evidently, Lily was one of the few who hadn't watched the news. Only Isaiah seemed unfazed by the information. As usual, he was digging in his backpack like he did every morning. Lily and Katie took their seats and waited for the bell to ring. "All right," Mr. Higgins said as soon as the bell stopped. "I'm sure you've all heard about the virus by now." An older man with a receding hairline and a salt and pepper goatee, Mr. Higgins reminded Lily slightly of Mr. Rogers, at least until he began assigning essays. Katie shot her a look with raised eyebrows as if to say, "See, I told you so." "So let's discuss what we know about viruses in general and what we know about this one." A sinister gleam danced in his eyes as he clapped his hands together, and Lily stifled a sigh. There would be more than one paper around this virus. As the discussion waged on around her, Lily found herself being drawn in. Though no one really knew how the virus had originated, what was known was that the first diagnosed patient was a technician at a lab in China. Evidently, he'd thought he just had a cold or a mild case of the flu. However, a week later, his lungs began to shut down and he was placed on a ventilator. While he was unconscious, 4 more people from his lab also became sick, and the number increased from there. It appeared that although patient 0 had recovered, many others had not, and the death count was now nearing the hundreds in China and the surrounding areas. The news media was referring to it as INCAV, or a novel contagious airborne virus. The novel aspect evidently came from the fact that it had markers and qualities that had never been seen before. "Mr. Higgins, is there any way this virus could come to us?" The question had been posed by Hannah, a quiet, studious girl, but Lily was pretty sure it was the question on all of the students' minds. She watched Mr. Higgins eagerly as he tried to formulate his answer. After a large, deep breath, he sighed and looked them all in the eyes as he said, "I'm not sure." "What does this mean for us?" Candace asked as she glanced around the room. Doctors from nearly every department filled the room. "We don't know yet," Dr. Akins, the hospital chief, said. In his late 60s, he was a stern man with gray hair and a paunch belly. His muscular arms hinted that he had been in shape at one time, though. "What we do know is that it is highly unlikely the virus won't make it here, and we need to be prepared. We have some PPE, but not enough for what they're saying we will need. However, we have a request with the governor for more, and I've heard talk that the president is offering assistance." He paused, as if surveying the room. "I'm not going to lie. We are on the front lines, and we don't know much about what we're fighting. Remember the most important pieces. Wash your hands, get plenty of rest, and gear up. Every time." He paused to look each one of them in the eye. "Okay, I know that's a lot, but does anyone have any questions?" Candace had a plethora of questions racing through her mind, but none that Dr. Akins could answer. No, she needed to call Raven and Pastor Ben and get their take on this. As much as she didn't want to admit it, she had a very bad feeling that this might be the beginning of the tribulation Raven had spoken of. As soon as they were dismissed, Candace excused herself to an on-call room and dialed Raven's number. She didn't even bother with pleasantries when the other woman answered. "Is this it? Do you think this is the beginning?" Raven sighed on the other end. "I'm assuming you mean the virus." "Of course I mean the virus," Candace snapped. "I just left a briefing where we were told to gear up and get ready for it. I just want your opinion. Do you think this is it?" "I don't know, but it could be. I'll start looking, Candace, and we'll talk more on Sunday. But promise me one thing." "What's that?" Candace asked, although she was fairly certain she knew what Raven would ask. "Be careful." That seemed to be the theme of the day around her. "I will," Candace promised before hanging up the phone. But if the virus was the beginning of the tribulation, could she ever really be careful enough? "What we know now is that the INCAV has appeared in countries outside of China, Cases have appeared in London, Italy, and Germany, but the president and his team continue to state there is no reason for worry here in the United States. Though he was originally vilified for the action, it appears the president closed the borders to travel from China last month and remains confident that action will keep the virus from breaching our borders. Raven felt a claw-like sensation squeeze her heart, and her fingers began to play with the cross around her neck. She'd told Candace she wasn't sure this was the beginning of the end, but the more coverage she watched of it, the more she became convinced that it would have a role to play. She jumped to her feet. Kat's letter. She needed to read it again. Though she hadn't really understood what the letter meant at the time, she had taken it and the Bible and journal with her nearly everywhere she went and had studied it with every free moment. The Sunday after the rapture, she'd met Pastor Ben, who, while having been left behind, at least seemed to have more knowledge of the Word than she did. They'd begun studying Kat's words together, along with a few other people who had joined their small group. That first day, it had just been herself, the pastor, and one other man by the name of Nathan, but they'd all agreed there had to be more like them out there. Raven had set up a website for the church, advertising that the message of hope and truth was available every Sunday. Attendance had gradually increased to a group of about 50 now, and Pastor Ben said the other churches were also seeing a surge. Evidently, other people were beginning to search for the truth as well. Raven scanned the letter again before grabbing her phone and dialing Pastor Ben. "Are you watching the news?" she asked when he answered. "I am." "What can we do? Candace called me and told me they just had a safety briefing about it." "I'm not sure. Right now, I guess we watch and wait. But I will admit that I'm scared for what this might mean for our church, especially since we have just started rebuilding. It appears they are already locking businesses down in China." "They couldn't lock down things here, could they?" Raven couldn't imagine how that would work. The U.S. was too big, and the states were too different. "I don't know, Raven. I just don't know. There is one thing we can do, though. We can pray." They ended the call, and Raven stared at the news screen. They had already suffered so much with the loss of so many lives. Could they handle an unknown virus? And if not, what did that mean?